This is The Dime, a 10-minute dive into the cannabis and hemp industry through trends, insights, predictions, and tangents.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to The Dime. This week, we've got a very special guest, Bruce Eckfeldt, strategic business coach, author, and host of two very popular podcasts, Thinking Outside the Bud and Scaling Services. Bruce, thanks for your time. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Bryan. Thank you. I appreciate you having me on today.
Absolutely. Before we get started, can you give a little background about your experience and how you got into the cannabinoid industry?
Yeah. So long story short, so originally actually I was an architect, but I got into software late 90s, worked with a couple of big consulting agency here in New York, and focused mainly on product strategy, product development, user experience design. I got more involved in tech, how to build out these technical products, and then founded a tech company back in 2002. Grew and scaled that, sold it about 6 years ago, and pivoted into coaching, advising and coaching. And I picked up a couple of cannabis clients pretty quickly and just got fascinated by the space. Personally, was not a big cannabis user up until about 5 years ago. I broke my back. And so I ended up 17-hour surgery and recovery. And someone said, hey, you should try cannabis. So I started using really as part of my post-surgery recovery. And it was phenomenal, worked really well. I ended up finding myself sleeping really well and all these things. So, became a user at that point, really kind of out of a medical point of view. And started the podcast to really build up my network, understand the space better from a business point of view. And for the last 4 or 5 years now, I've been working, probably about half my business has been focused on cannabis and cannabis-related companies, helping them figure out how to grow and scale, right? And it's really strategic coaching, right? So I help them, CEOs and leadership teams, figure out what their strategy is, how are they going to execute on it, how to build up their company, how to build up the culture, how to build up the team, and just work with them on that process.
Awesome. And this week, I think the topic is perfect for your background and the kind of blend between the in-industry and the outside industry. So I guess the first question I have for you would be, what is the number one issue that arises in cannabis that is typically overlooked by outside industry?
I think with number one, I don't know. There's many number ones, I guess. I think the biggest one is the perception that, there's just all this money in cannabis and it's, falling off the trees or falling off the plants and you just need to stand there with your arms open and you're going to make gobs of money. The fact is like any industry, there's challenges, right? And the whole reason that, not everyone is in it is because you have to figure out how to navigate those challenges. There are particular ones in cannabis which are hard, mainly or a lot of them kind of stemming from the fact that we're still federally illegal. And while the states have legalized and it does allow people to operate cannabis companies, it does cause some problems when it comes to normal course of business. And some of them, I think, get very surprising for people, entrepreneurs, founders, CEOs, businesses coming into cannabis that are not familiar with it can kind of get caught flat-footed, or there are things that you wouldn't expect to have to deal with because you certainly don't have to deal with them in other industries.
Can you name one of those that?
Yeah. I mean, it's like I said, a lot of them derive from the legal issue, the fact that we're federally legal. The big one I would say is banking. All the normal financial services, institutions, processes, credit card transactions, loans, banking services, all that kind of stuff that every other industry that is a legal industry has access to. Unfortunately, cannabis does not. And it stems from the fact that it is declared federally illegal. So the banks can't, or in order to do business with cannabis companies, it gets quite complicated because they're technically facilitating illegal activity, which requires all this kind of reporting issues. And it either means that services are very expensive or it means that banks just won't touch it. There's actually a couple of cases recently that founder of Ease, one of the payment services, just pled guilty to bank fraud and financial fraud, and because they were skirting around the issues. And in the end, while it was it was legal for the states, it's not legal federally, and so it causes a lot of problems there. So, bank accounts are an issue. Credit card processing is an issue. All these things, which, like I said, normally most companies, most industries just take for granted. They're just kind of fundamental services. Are not that way in cannabis. It's changing, and hopefully there's some legislation that might get passed. There's a Safe Banking Act that will change some of that stuff for cannabis, but it's still a huge issue. So banking is certainly a big one. The other one that's somewhat related is from a tax point of view. Again, because we're federally legal, the tax code does not allow you, the IRS tax code does not allow you to deduct business expenses for illegal activity, illegal businesses. It all stems from a 1981 case from a drug dealer successfully sued the IRS to be able to deduct his business expenses for his illegal drug business. And they immediately changed the tax law, 280E section of the tax code that rectified that. But the problem is for cannabis businesses, your taxation situation is quite ugly. You end up getting taxed at a very, very high level because you cannot deduct normal business operating expenses. There's some ways around it. There's some things you can do with pushing things back to cost of goods sold. You can minimize it, but the fact is still either you're paying lots of taxes or you're paying a lot of money to avoid paying lots of taxes. So it is a non-trivial, significant problem for most cannabis companies.
Yeah, and I think you did a really good job of kind of breaking those down. Those are two of the most popular ones where people who are approaching us about interest in entering the space and we present them with some of these obstacles, they're like, what are you talking about? Why would that be that way? And that's some of the obstacles and the challenges that the operators in the space are currently facing. Kellan, are those two the two main popular ones that you've experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I have personal experience with both of those issues, and it actually caused me to motivated me to switch kind of my career path is from operating a facility in the cannabis space to kind of providing more ancillary services to it, if you will. It just became really, really frustrating when, as a scientist, if I'm trying to do an R&D project, instead of being like, hey, what's our budget? Can I go do this? How do I purchase it? All of those things just created more obstacles, and it just never was as cut and dry as like, hey, call up Thermo, order these chemicals, and then you can do this. It's Thermo doesn't take cash. Then the banking thing is challenging. Any last bit of money you can put into the bank is used to keep the lights on in terms of paying you utilities and all these other normal business expenses, right? And so it became a headache. And not only that, I mean, 280E was huge. Unfortunately, for one of the companies I work for, they weren't aware of 280E. And then all of a sudden their accountant was like, so it's been a year and now here's your tax bill. And it's a very, very large 10-digit number. And so it was crippling to the company. I mean, they're still around, right? But it just became way more frustrating to try to operate in the space to achieve normal goals that you would in any other business, that it just wasn't possible in the cannabis space. And so I'm really looking forward to those changes, because I think it'll be an accelerator event for a lot of the R&D projects that have been kind of in the back of a lot of these people's minds. At least that's my opinion on it, but it definitely affected me negatively.
I'm sure. I've heard horror stories of people trying to pay their tax bill, and because they're dealing with cash, it turns out the IRS does not like it when you pay your tax bill by cash, so they actually charge you, I can't remember if it's 5% or 10% or something like that. So not only do you have to pay more tax than everyone else, but if you're paying in cash, you got to pay a premium surcharge.
It's a cannabis tax on a cannabis tax.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just full of these cases. No, I mean, the fact is that everyone has to deal with this, right? So it's, if you can figure out how to be a successful cannabis company, or it's so somewhat of a level playing field, and everyone has to figure out how to deal with these challenges. And if you can figure out how to deal with them well, that's an advantage, right? Like, it can be a strategic tool. I mean, the other ones that I think that people don't think about it as much, I mean, certainly there's the state line issue. So one of the big challenges, if you're a plant touching company, normally you would centralize all your operations. You would, figure out how to, manufacture in one spot and then distribute. Well, you can't do that with cannabis. If you're touching plant, or if the material you have is containing THC, you can't cross state lines. So you see these kind of crazy things of people like putting machinery on flatbeds, and they drive it across the state line with nothing in it, so they can take the packaging machine to the next state and do their packaging there on Tuesdays, and then they run it to a different state on Wednesdays. I mean, there's ways of getting around it, but this whole state line thing can be really interesting in terms of how it affects operations and your strategy. And then the other one that I think is just kind of coming to bear right now is all the intellectual property and the protection from an IP point of view, is that, again, because we're federally legal, you cannot use federal services or federal courts to protect IP related to cannabis specific claims, right? So you can get around it by doing kind of this is an herbal extraction technology, or brands that are not cannabis specific and stuff. But trademarks, intellectual property is still kind of up in the air, and exactly how some of this stuff is going to play out. Again, you can do some of the stuff at the state level, but it's complicated. If you're operating in California and you want to protect your stuff in Colorado, well, if someone else has already captured that in Colorado, it's a state by state game. So I think these things end up really kind of changing the context, changing the playing field for a lot of folks in terms of how you approach cannabis or how you grow and scale a cannabis company.
I want to ask a side question on the first point is, as these regulations adjust and these vertically integrated companies decide, okay, we're not really the strongest in cultivation, we're better in processing or in distribution. Do you see a lot of these companies that have scaled to vertical integrations kind of selling off bits and pieces and then reorging and doubling down on their strengths? So how do you kind of see that working out? Because that's going to be a big strategic differences as these companies kind of throw back their cards and decide, okay, we're going to focus on our strengths now and really double down in those areas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see this playing out in lots of different industries. I mean, if you look at microprocessors, if you look at, the PC market, Apple took a very proprietary, integrated approach, right? They own everything from the retail side to the manufacturing, the software design, chip manufacturing. I mean, they're a highly vertically integrated group. Other people like Windows and Microsoft and stuff like that took a very, hey, we're just going to build the operating system. Everyone else can build the machines. Anyone can write software for it. So it's a little bit of a strategy or a little bit of a market maturity. What I generally find is that early markets, successful companies tend to be vertically integrated because there's no standards and there's no ecosystem to be able to have specialization, right? So you've got to do the growing, you've got to process, you've got to brand it, you've got to dispense it, you've got to you have to control a lot of it to be able to create the product you want. As a market matures, you will see standards, you will see ecosystem, a market for the various pieces. So now I can say, look, we're really great at processing. I don't have to grow because that's the only way I know what I'm going to get. There are standards, there are ways of verified. There's a market for it. I can go buy biomass, at a quality and a volume and in a way that I want to be able to process, and vice versa. Like, I don't need to be able to do the dispensing. I don't need to do the branding and the packaging. Other people can be experts in that, but it takes a while for that market to mature, for enough players to be in there where there's competitive pricing. And you'll see, I mean, I think some groups will still want to have a high degree of vertical integration just because of the nature of what they're producing and the control that they want over it. But I think generally you'll see specialization happen over time. People will choose that part of the chain that they want to be really, really good at, and they will focus on that and let other people do what they do well.
Yeah, I think that's a great breakdown. And then kind of going back to the 280E, I don't think our listeners really understand how much of a hindrance that is in some of these large operators from like a cash standpoint. And some of these business expenses that are not able to be written off, once they're able to, what's that going to look like to their books for their valuation standpoint? I mean, is that just going to be cash that's all of a sudden available for them?
I mean, to some extent. I mean, I guess I generally assume that valuations have anticipated or have baked in that price, right? Like, baked in the fact that this will happen at some point. Now, as that becomes more or less likely in a shorter or long period of time, those valuations may change a little bit. But people have already kind of valued that. People assume, and I think with reasonable, it's reasonable to assume that at some point that stuff will get rectified or that it will get changed. It's a little bit of game of when. In terms of how it impacts the businesses, I mean, to some extent, yes, it means that they'll have more capital to kind of grow and scale. But quite honestly, I mean, it's going to happen with everyone at the same time. And like I said, it's somewhat baked into the price. So I think I think it's more of an issue if it doesn't happen sooner rather than later. How hard is it going to be for some of these companies? I don't think it's going to be like all of a sudden everything just starts to explode because the 280 is changed. But yeah, it's going to be, it's going to shift the finances and how people deal with the business side.
And I wonder, as more time goes on, is there going to be more of a separation between the small guys and the big guys? Because that difference, like you were saying before, about understanding how the game is played and being able to put things in different buckets is an expensive one. And cannabis at its core is an extremely expensive one. So do you think the difference between the small guys and the big guys is really separating, or do you think there's still an opportunity for one of these smaller fish that's maybe not as popular to catch a Trulia, a Green Thumbs, a Cresco in a large scale way?
Well, I think there's always going to be opportunities at various levels of the market. I mean, I don't think that it means that you're gonna crowd out all of the smaller players. But yes, I honestly, I don't think it's so much the smaller and the big players inside cannabis right now. It's the big players outside of cannabis that are going to get into cannabis, right? When big pharma gets involved in this, I mean, even the Crescos and stuff, they're going to get clobbered, right? So it's, I think you're dealing with, you've got the really small fish and these medium fish, which are the large fish right now, but you don't, the megalodons still haven't come in to the waters yet, right? And when the laws change and federal stance changes, yeah, you're going to see, big shifts in the market. That said, it's going to be a dynamic growing market. There's still going to be lots of opportunities. I'm a big believer in, if you can find a niche strategy, you can create a very nice business out of it. But yeah, if your goal is to take over the world, you're going to have to battle some pretty big players, both that are in the market right now, but a lot of players that are just not even in the water.
The game's going to change pretty big when Johnson & Johnson's enters the competition and people are like, whoa, who are these guys? When did they get in? It's like, well, we just bought everybody. So now we are the kings in town now.
Yeah. And that's what they're going to do. Right. Yeah, it's very clear. And honestly, that's a lot of the strategy work that I do, is kind of figuring out how to position these companies so that they're either, we have a niche enough play so that we can have a protected or, a position that we can protect reasonably well, or we just are super attractive as a acquisition target. Right. So it's gonna be a lot easier for these companies to roll up and buy some of these groups than it is to build their own. So, hey, why not just be a really attractive piece of bait?
Kellan, do you have any favorite outside targets that you think will come in, and any sort of egregious predictions in that regard?
I mean, Johnson & Johnson, I think they've kind of like dipped their toe in through some back alleyways already. I think Big Pharma, though. I mean, Altria, the Big Tobacco and Big Pharma are kind of the two that stand out in my mind. I could see maybe Cargill, right? I know that they're private, but Cargill is huge, right? Cargill is huge. And based on the fact that the hemp industry is moving closer to commoditization, and Cargill runs agricultural commodities, right? Pretty much. Cannabis, I think, will become a commodity. And I could see Cargill just kind of continuing to own the agricultural commodity space by making a bunch of really large acquisitions of the strongest cultivators in the space. And at the end of the day, if you look at the supply chain of cannabis and any other product that's generated in that space, it's all based on the plant and the agricultural product of the flower. And so by controlling the flower, I think that they'll inherently have the ability to manipulate everything downstream from that perspective. So I could see like a Cargill coming in and dropping $50 billion to acquire some of the larger players in the space to just now own it. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Bruce, do you have a prediction?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the challenge is, or I think that the thing about cannabis is multi sort of threaded, right? I mean, we've got the medical side, we've got adult use side, we've got hemp, we've got industrial hemp, the CBD. Like, there's various pieces here. I think some of these are going to play out in different ways. I think I think industrial hemp is going to be its own thing, right? I think, and until those markets really mature, until all those production chains, can accept hemp fiber versus pulp versus wood fiber, like that will be its own thing. I think the question on the kind of consumable cannabis side, yeah, I mean, I would expect that you're going to end up with something like we have in, say beer and alcohol, where you've got some big players, right? You've got the Budweisers, you've got the Coors, you've got these big national brands, and then you've got all these kind of craft brands that are regional and local, that are still strong, great companies. And yes, they get kind of bought up by the bigger players once they get big enough and stuff. But I think you'll see some kind of market distribution that looks like that in the cannabis space. And I think mainly because it's going to be both kind of a consumable, but it's also going to have this kind of artisan craft angle to it as well. So I think you're always going to have some kind of craft element to cannabis, particularly on the flower side.
Yeah, I also wonder if first mover advantage is in play here, because the space is so dynamic that if one of these large Budweiser or Pepsi comes in and purchases this large conglomerate, is that going to be a strategic advantage, or is that going to hurt them because then one of their competitors could pivot in? It's going to be such an interesting chess match from like a strategy dynamic to understand when the right time is to attract one of these partners and to gobble up one of these larger fish that say, hey, like, we're a buyout candidate, and kind of how that unfolds and that speed that unfolds. There's so many variables in play. It's going to make a really interesting next 6 to 12 months.
I mean, the challenge is this is unlike any other industry because of this federal legalization issue. So in any other industry where you'd have an early stage, you'd have an early stage industry and things develop, and you've got these early players and they grow, and then the bigger players start to come in and they start to roll up and they can start to consolidate. It all happens kind of naturally and fluid. Right now, the problem is the big players, they're relegated to the sidelines because of the legal issues. So all of these companies are kind of growing in this petri dish, and and they're getting bigger than they normally would, and things are kind of playing out in this weird microcosm. And then all of a sudden, someone's going to blow a whistle, and all of these new players are going to come onto the field, and it's going to be, I don't know. I mean, I think it's going to be pretty dramatic. I think there's going to be, first mover advantage. I think everyone's going to want to move quickly because there's no reason not to. There's nothing yet to be figured out, or at least there's no let's dip our toe in the water. Like the water is going. I mean, people just need to get into space. They're just not because of the legal side. So I think you're going to see a lot of big, bold moves very, very quickly by the big players. And then it's going to calm, or things are going to kind of play out. And then you'll start to see more activity 6-12 months afterwards. Because I think everyone, these players are literally, they're teed up on the sidelines. They've got their bags of cash and they're just waiting for that whistle to go.
Yeah, we've heard some rumblings too. And it just, if some of the things that we've heard go down, it's just an absolute game changer and just changes the dynamic of how the whole space is played. So it'll definitely be a fun. I think the one dynamic that will really impact things is I think you're still going to have a state by state market, because these states are not going to just, oh, great, we're federally legal. Like anyone can sell weed in my state now. Like, no, they drop millions of dollars on these licenses and everything. So I think the big issue is going to be this what states put in place, or what restrictions and policies states put in place to handle interstate sale of cannabis. It's not going to be an immediate federal market, right? It's going to look fairly similar from how the markets play out and how the state by state commerce works. I mean, you'll probably have some things change fairly quickly around it, but it's going to take a while for that really to reformulate. Cool. Before we do predictions, we ask all of our guests 2 questions. In your experience, the biggest lesson that you've learned or takeaway to kind of express on to the next generation on, in my experience in cannabis, I've learned.
So my experience in cannabis, I've learned that not to make any assumptions. I think it's kind of true in life, but I think most of my harder learnings in cannabis, both directly and indirectly, have been because I've assumed that other industries work this way, or that's the way it works other places, that this is the way it must work in cannabis, and so I'm constantly double checking myself in terms of, okay, can I reasonably make this assumption over here? I would say that's kind of the big takeaway for me.
That's a good one. And the last time you consumed any cannabinoids?
I don't know.
So recently, we've had people on the show do it, so it's instantaneous. This is only an audio recording, but if it was a video, I think people would enjoy that moment. So prediction time. Which of the issues today will be the first to change, and which one do you think will have the biggest impact? Bruce, you go first.
I think the banking stuff. I think there's so much pressure on the banking side because it doesn't help anybody. I mean, no one likes the banking situation right now. So I suspect you'll get some change on the banking side. I think that's going to be pretty big. Look, I think the federal, changing federal scheduling of cannabis is going to be huge. I don't think it's going to happen as quickly as we kind of hope, and I actually don't think it's going to be quite as huge as we think it's going to be, because there's so many ripple effects that have to happen once that changes, that it's not going to be like, okay, I wake up tomorrow morning and all of a sudden there's cannabis plants everywhere growing around me. It's going to take a while.
I mean, I agree. I think banking is going to facilitate the largest change in the space. I mean, you're talking getting access to these large companies that are trying to grow as fast as possible, and now you're giving them access to the gasoline they need to grow. So being able to take loans and generate capital through the banking system for growth is going to be an absolute game changer right now, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I wish you guys didn't say banking, because I definitely agree with that. And from some of the reading that I've done, it's March 5th today. And some of the rumors have been early March. So the second or third week in March, something like that could be introduced. And hopefully that's what does go down. Obviously, the guy in the IRS came out, I think, last week and said that he's not happy with the cash stipulation, and you can understand why, right? It's dangerous and it's harder for him. So if he's making noise like that, obviously there's some conversations going on, and hopefully we'll get some change soon and that the space can get some of the much needed relief it deserves.
Yeah.
So Bruce, where can our listeners find you, get in touch with you? Do you have any social media handles you want to shout out?
Yeah, easiest way, my website is eckfeldt.com, eckfeldt.com. My email is just bruce@eckfeldt.com. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt on Instagram and LinkedIn and things like that. I'm pretty unique in terms of a name. You should be able to find me. Podcast is thinkingoutsidethebud.com. So you can find the website, and then we're on all the major platforms. So you can search for us there.
Great. We'll link it up all in the show notes. And for all the listeners out there, thanks for subscribing. Please leave us a review, and then check out Bruce's podcast. It's awesome, especially the one with Kellan on it. Thanks everyone for their time.